Welcome back to the Farm Show for Saturday, January 31st, 2026. You're listening to Westplex Talk 1045. Our neighbors down south at the Arkansas Division of Agriculture featured a talk hosted by the National Agricultural Law Center. USDA Deputy Secretary Stephen Vaden was the guest. Now, the whole chat lasted about an hour, actually a little bit over an hour, but we pulled select highlights, some of the most useful information for your bank account, and also probably the most entertaining and interesting. Harrison Pittman is the gentleman hosting the conversation, and you can find the whole hour plus long conversation by going to the Arkansas Division of Ag YouTube page. Deputy Secretary Vaden explained the One Big Beautiful Bill and key changes for farmers, including tax deductions, estate tax, reference prices, choosing between ARC and PLC, and much more. Let's hear what he had to say.
Going to start with talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the changes that it made, and then I'll talk about why I think I may have been the first person to refer to them as a need for a bridge to get us from where we are now to all of the provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which kick in the fall of this year. So the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, given the nomenclature where people are talking about Farm Bill 1.0 or a skinny farm bill, it's probably accurate to call the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It would be Farm Bill 1.0 or the Fat Farm Bill because there was so much agricultural policy fit in there. And for those involved in production agriculture and those lawyers who advise them, some of the key changes are making provisions that had heretofore been temporary permanent, particularly when it comes to tax law. Those heretofore temporary positions that allowed farmers to immediately expense, for example, when they purchased a new tractor, when they put up a new silo for grain storage on their farm, those are now permanent law. And the amounts that you can immediately deduct have been increased to $2.5 million. We've gotten rid of the estate tax, which is a huge issue for so many people who own farmland, for 99.9% of all estates. We have taken the exemption, we have raised it, we have made raising it permanent, and we have indexed it to inflation so that more and more people aren't brought into the estate tax over time simply because of a rise in the cost of living. And so that's going to make estate planning for so many of our family farmers, again, on a permanent basis with no expiration date, much easier. It also, for the first time in a long time, updated reference prices and updated crop insurance so that now, for the first time, quite frankly, probably since 2018 or 2019, our ARC and PLC programs will accurately reflect the increased cost of production that farmers have seen throughout the past several years. And we have made it easier to get crop insurance, and we have increased the subsidy to encourage people to get crop insurance so that they can hedge the risk and make certain that there's easier financial stability for their operation. In addition, producers for this year who are waiting for their ARC PLC payments, which will come in October of this year, they're not going to have to worry about electing ARC or PLC. I cannot be involved in production agriculture in this role as deputy secretary, but prior to this, when I was and working with my brother, maybe your audience is wiser than we are, but we always pick the wrong one. If we picked ARC, it was PLC that we should have picked and vice versa. This year, producers aren't going to have to worry about that because we at USDA are going to do the math for them. And whatever program would pay their operation the most, that's what they'll get automatically. And so all of that is going to kick in full in October of this year. That explains why we needed the bridge payment program, because we've just completed the 25 crop year. Farmers are sitting down with their business managers, their bankers, family members, and they're determining how is it going to look for this next growing season in calendar year 26, and how are we going to maintain the finances that we need in order to get there. And so given the realities of increased input costs, as well as commodity prices not where we want them, we set aside a total of $12 billion from the Commodity Credit Corporation to provide in the form of bridge payments. 11 billion of that 12 billion will go to the large commodity crop farmers. 1 billion has been set aside to be split between sugar producers and specialty crops. For the $11 billion that we have set aside for row crops, we intend to make the program function, as far as the producers are concerned, a lot like ECAP, the Emergency Commodity Assistance Program, which we rolled out and implemented in 2025. So what that means is that currently our team at the Farm Service Agency is hard at work pre-filling out forms for all of the eligible producers based on the information they filed with the Farm Service Agency in crop year 2025. Those should be ready next month. And when a producer comes to their FSA office to sign up, all they will need to do is look at that pre-filled out form and confirm the information listed on it is correct. Assuming that it is, they need only take out a pen, sign their name at the bottom of the page, and return it to our USDA employee. Once they've done that, they're finished. And a couple business days later, just like with ECAP, they'll receive a direct deposit to their checking account with the bridge payment included. And so we're trying to make it as easy as possible and doing all the work up front for our farmers so that all they need to do is sign their name and then wait a few days to see the check directly deposited into their checking account. We also published, as you know, Harrison, on the 31st of December, what the payment rate should be. So every farmer can go to the USDA website, look at each of the crops listed for the 11 billion portion that go to row crops. They can see how much the payment rate is. They can multiply that by their production last year, and both they and their banker can have certainty as to the amount of money that will be reaching their checking account by the end of February. And that will help their banker make certain that their cash flow situation is accurately reported and considered as they make lending decisions for the operating loans necessary to get the 26 crop in the ground.
Then Harrison asked how payment limitations factor in.
Well, we made the decision with the bridge payments to have the payment limitations apply. And the reason why we did that, it was a policy call, and it was made for the following two reasons. Number one, we have a limited set of money. The Commodity Credit Corporation is a definitive pool, and obviously a large part of it is already spoken for because it funds the normal Farm Bill programs like ARC, PLC, and the wonderful conservation programs run by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So there was a definitive and limited pool from which we could draw. Secondly, the data that we have reviewed tends to show that while for row crops, obviously it's across the board, the prices are lower than farmers need them to be, and input costs are higher than they should be. When you looked at smaller operations, they were disproportionately suffering harm from this combination of squeezing from both sides of the balance sheet. So having a limited pool of money and having data that showed that smaller producers, who obviously would come in under the payment limits with regard to their gross income and other calculations, we made the decision to apply the payment limits so that to the extent we were showing any bias, we were showing bias in favor of those producers that the data showed were disproportionately suffering the worst from this combination of circumstances.
Harrison Pittman moved on to ask about China, Brazil, and even opened the door for Vaden to talk about trade agreements and farm bills. And what about tariffs? You know, it wouldn't be a talk with a Trump administration official if it didn't include some commentary about old sleepy Joe Biden. Here's what Vaden had to say.
I think it's important to remember where we were. This is the 21st of January. We've just crossed the 1-year mark into the president's second term. So when the president came into office on the 20th of January, 2025, it's important not to forget where we were. It was the policy of the previous administration that they weren't interested in new trade agreements. That is to say, even if a country came to the United States and said, we'd really like to negotiate a new trade agreement with you, as the United Kingdom did, for example, their answer was no, we're not interested. So there were no new trade agreements, no new markets open for American agriculture for 4+ years. On top of that, you had not only trade stasis, you had policy stasis. Because a fact for your listeners, Harrison, if you go all the way back to 1933, so in other words, to Franklin Roosevelt's first term as president, every person to have held the office of the presidency, except for two, can say the same thing. They signed a farm bill. The two that did not sign a farm bill were Gerald Ford, who served a truncated 2.5-year term following Richard Nixon's resignation, and our previous president, Joe Biden. So, to put it more accurately, Joe Biden is the only president who served an entire 4-year term in modern American history who didn't sign a farm bill. So for American agriculture, for 4+ years, you had no new markets being opened and no new farm bill and trade policy. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about agriculture or whether we're talking about manufacturing or whether we're talking about the service sector. If you spend 4 years treading water and not innovating and not growing and not progressing, you're going to fall behind. And that's what's happened. And even more unfortunate for our American farmers is while we were taking a vacation, our competitors were not. And you hit on the most important competitor. That's Brazil. They have been steadily, reliably, and unceasingly increasing their agricultural footprint. Whether we're talking about corn, soy, sugar, cotton, and for the first time ever, last year, they exceeded our production in beef. They have been taking our market share and challenging us for our customers. And so whenever someone wants to talk about China, I understand that, but it's important to remember China is the symptom, it's not the cause. If we were to go back 10 years ago and we had the same policy we do now, the Chinese would still have would be in a much worse situation in that they would have to buy from us. There was no other supplier that could meet the level of commodities that they needed to purchase. Thanks to the unceasing growth of Brazilian agriculture, largely at the cost of burning down the Amazon rainforest, it's important to know, the Chinese now have a choice about from whom they buy. And they are exercising that choice. And what's more, when we look further into the future, Harrison, we know the Chinese would ultimately like to be self-sufficient. They would like to rely on both Brazil and the United States less for commodities and have more of them grown by Chinese, or not if Chinese, the near abroad to them, Russian farmers in the Far East. All of that paints a picture of a situation in which if you're dependent on only one customer or one primary customer to purchase whatever it is you're selling, agricultural commodities especially, you're in trouble. And that's where we found ourselves on the 20th of January, 2025, largely dependent on one customer who now had a choice about where it chose to make its agricultural purchases, all the while having done nothing to open up new trade markets. So that's why this administration has pivoted to focusing on stabilizing trade with China, which is important. That's why you have that baseline agreement to purchase at a minimum 12 million metric tons of soybeans this marketing year and 25 million metric tons of soybeans for each of the next 3 marketing years. Update for your listeners, China's more than 80% of the way toward meeting that, and the marketing year has yet to end for 25-26. We expect them to meet the 12 million metric ton goal and move on to the 25 million metric ton for each of the next succeeding 3 years. So they're on the path to meeting their commitments, which is important. But we've got to open up more markets in other countries so our farmers have more places to sell. And anytime you are starting from a complete stop which is where we found ourselves 4 years worth of stoppage. In January of 2025, it's going to take some time to get up to speed. But that's why I was happy that as we got into the third and fourth quarters of last calendar year, we began to see new trade agreements and new trade frameworks with Southeast Asia, Japan, and countries in the Western Hemisphere. And many of the barriers we were knocking down were not tariff related, because as is so often the case in agriculture, they're non-tariff barriers, like phytosanitary concerns, which have no scientific backing, or the European Union's effort to use geographic indicators to box out American farmers' products from being able to compete on an even playing field in foreign countries. It's one of the most underreported aspects of the trade agreements that have been reached thus far, Harrison. That's why I want to emphasize that really for the first time in decades, we have successfully knocked down in countries like Indonesia, in countries like Argentina, the European Union's efforts to say, if it doesn't come from the EU, you can't call it Parmesan cheese. If it doesn't come from France, you can't call it champagne. If it doesn't come from one of our countries, you can't call it Asiago, and the many other names which are common names in trade that everyone understands, and yet they want to trademark because their original origin happened to be a European country. And so as these barriers fall, and as this administration continues to work to open up new markets, farmers will have more places to sell than just one country, which, given the market dynamics, is critical.
Okay, we've got to head into commercial right now. Don't go anywhere. When we come back, biofuels. We'll also talk about glyphosate, right to repair, and if we have time, foreign ownership of U.S. farmland. You're listening to The Farm Show on Westplex Talk 104.5.